our dear friend and luminary, Archbishop VIGANÒ, has published yet another letter that people need to know about. Now, why is it important? This is important for a number of reasons. You've heard me talk about Archbishop VIGANÓ before. And it is important coming from him in particular, because he was the Vatican ambassador to the United States. He was the Pope's chosen ambassador to represent the Holy See in its relationships with the most important, arguably, country on earth at the moment, okay? So he's not a slouch, he's not a second-rate guy that, you know, the Vatican just doesn't go by Home Depot to see who's standing outside to hire to get a diplomat, you know? He's cultivated, educated, has personality, things that was popular in Vatican circles. It's very important too because he is the one saying these things. He knows politics, good politics, dirty politics, inside and out. I mean, he was the ambassador, right? He knows the faith. He knows he was an archbishop. Finally, let me just comment before this that a lot of what he says, he will say, we've known that for years. And frankly, okay, what he's saying I have been talking about for almost 40 years of my life, okay? And many of you have been talking about it for 50 or 60 years, I mean, ever since Vatican II. And so we would say, okay, so he's a little late to realize these things. But please appreciate God's providence in this. I am not an archbishop. Hey, no, you know why I'm not an archbishop? Because God doesn't want me to be an archbishop, okay? Plain and simple. Because I realized what he's talking about 40 years ago, I'm lucky to be a priest. It's God's providence that I'm a priest. When I started coming to the realization of what was happening in the church, there's no question that the Freemasonic church establishment would stop me from going anywhere up in the church. But because he didn't realize it, he became an archbishop and in a position to speak about what he speaks about. Because he woke up late. He didn't start stomping his mouth off like I did years and years ago. He went along with everything, and they thought he was one of their boys. And as it turns out, maybe he was at the time, but he's not anymore. As I said, I'm not going to read the whole thing. In fact, it's also important. It's hard to pick what parts to me. I'll synthesize some of it. Okay, and why this is also important for anybody here who has any contact with the modern church to take this to heart. The modern church meaning the dioceses, the Pope, the cardinals, the bishops, what passes for the modern day church. It's important for you to hear this. Not meaning to give anything away, but that's not the Catholic Church. And this is what he says. Don't kill the messenger, but essentially what he says is that is something else, and he tells you why. So the first thing he does, he thanks Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who is another kind of a luminary, hasn't gotten it quite as much as Bishop VIGANÓ, Archbishop VIGANÓ, but he's getting there. And he wrote a paper Bishop Schneider was one of the 4 people who signed the dubia, given 3 cardinals and Bishop Schneider, that was given to the Pope to try to correct his errors in the face of Amoris Laetitia, which was his document on marriage and things like that. He was one of those signers. Of course, it came to nothing. The Pope didn't recant any of his errors or do anything like that. So anyway, Bishop Schneider has been talking more and more about it. And now, so Archbishop VIGANÓ is thanking him for his letter and then going beyond his letter. And the first point he makes is, he talks about ecumenical councils. When we talk about ecumenical councils, you know he's getting to the point of Vatican II, which was the latest ecumenical council in the church. Now, he talks about it, he goes, throughout the history of the church, mind you, with the exception of Vatican II, every ecumenical council that has been called to right a wrong, to address a heresy. Vatican II was not called to address any heresy. In fact, they caused more heresies than they address any of them. But he said they're all caused to right or wrong. And he says it's kind of interesting. He says, for example, the one council, which was the synod, it was a synod, it wasn't an ecumenical council, but the Pope was present there, of Pistoia in 1786. They got together and they were condemning some heretics at the time. And what were these heretics saying? The heretics were saying there should be no communion outside of Mass. There should be, we should have the Mass in the vernacular tongue, like English or Italian or whatever. It shouldn't be in Latin. They were saying that the prayers of the canon, you know the part of the Mass, the middle part where the consecration is, where you don't hear my voice. The heretics were saying that should all be out loud. And what does this sound like, right? And they were talking about this notion of collegiality that somebody had proposed, that it was heretical, that they were this college of bishops of which the Pope was just one, and the Pope had a mere ministerial function. Okay, whatever. He makes the point that years later, the council presided over by John the 23rd, Vatican II, implemented all these things that had been condemned in the past. All right? So that was his first step there. And he said very importantly, he goes, there comes a moment in our life when through the disposition of providence, we speak of the choice between understanding the error into which practically all of us have fallen, almost always without evil intentions, and wanting to continue to look the other way or justify ourselves. So he said there comes a time when you realize something's wrong, and you either have to understand the error of your ways or you have to look the other way. He is choosing to understand the root of the error and talk about it. 99.9999% of the bishops, including the Pope, are either complicit in this or looking the other way, is what he's saying. He talks about ecumenism, where when ecumenism, you know what ecumenism is, it's like all religions are the same, let's all just get together and have a barbecue, and you know, the Catholic religion is one religion, but Hinduism is another, and Buddhism, and we just all have to, you know, we all worship the same God anyway, and so we all have to get along. That's what ecumenism is. And he's saying in the early days, we meaning the archbishop and the other bishops and things, thought ecumenism was trying to bring everybody into the fold of the Catholic Church. But they realized that these people had their agendas, right? He said, we have thought that certain excesses were only an exaggeration of those who allowed themselves to be swept up in enthusiasm for novelty. So they saw the excess, the things going on. There weren't excesses, it was according to their plan. And he said, we thought that these people were just swept up in a desire for novelty, and it was nothing serious, that they weren't mainstream, but they were. And he said, we sincerely believe that seeing John Paul II surrounded by the charmers, healers, Buddhist monks, imams, rabbis, Protestant pastors, and other heretics gave proof of the Church's ability to summon people together in order to ask God for peace. While the authoritative example of this action initiated a deviant succession of pantheons that were more or less official, even to the point of seeing bishops carrying the unclean idol of the Pachamama on their shoulders, sacrilegiously concealed under the pretext of being a representation of sacred motherhood. And so he goes into that. He goes, he realizes that this was their intention. This is where Vatican II leads to the accepting of the idol worship that went on there. But it happened before. Not everybody here knows about it, but Pope John Paul II did largely the same thing. He was very into ecumenism. He had this big ecumenical, let's all get together and you know, worship together thing at Assisi, in which he allowed them to place the statue of Buddha on top of the tabernacle and to incense it. Okay, to worship Buddha on top of a Catholic tabernacle in a Catholic church. church. It did not strike any of us as surprising when the church was destroyed later in an earthquake, but he never did get the message. We got the message. He didn't get the message. Okay. So he says, we want to get along with everybody. He says there can be no brotherhood except in Christ. Only in Christ. Qui non est mecum contra me est. Who is not with me is against me. He goes on to, he said, we wrote it off to different things, he said, but without looking at the root problem. He says, it is surprising that people persist in not wanting to investigate the root causes of the present crisis, meaning none of these bishops are willing to look into the fact that it is Vatican II at the root of the problems and the heresies in the church. They refuse to look at it and accept that this beloved council of theirs is what has practically destroyed the church and is continuing to do so, if there's anything left of it in the modern church circles at all. Limiting themselves to deploring the present excesses as if they were not the logical and inevitable consequence of a plan orchestrated decades ago. If the Pachamama could be adored in a church, we owe it to Dignitatis Humanae. If we have a liturgy that is Protestantized and at times even paganized, that's the new Mass. So he's referring to, by the way, the Mass that people go to in their parishes that's in English or Chinese or Vietnamese or whatever it is, that it is a Protestant and pagan Mass. It's not a Catholic Mass, which we've been saying for years. Interesting to see him say that now in public, an archbishop of the Catholic Church is I hate to use the term, but they say, woke. He got woke, right? Was he woked? I guess he was awakened. I'm not sure. But anyway, he's getting there. And he goes through all these things, and he said, if the Abu Dhabi, if we owe it to the revolutionary action of Monsignor Annibale Bugnini and the post-conciliar reforms, they say. If the Abu Dhabi Declaration was signed, we owe it to Nostra Aetate. If we have come to the point of delegating the bishop's decisions, the decisions of bishops' conferences to other people or to them, and then we owe it to collegiality, yada, yada, yada. Thanks to synodality, we find ourselves with the Amoris Laetitia having to look for a way to prevent what was obvious to everyone from appearing. That this document, prepared by an impressive organizational machine, intended to legitimize communion for the divorced and cohabitating, just as Perida Amazonia will be used to legitimize women priests, as in the recent case of an Episcopal vicaress in Freiburg, and the abolition of sacred celibacy. The prelates who sent the dubia to Francis, in my opinion, demonstrated the same pious ingenuousness. And pious ingenuous means they had good intentions, but there were false expectations. They should have known better. Somebody you could be ingenuous, disingenuous, however it is, but it basically means they had false expectations. Thinking that Bergoglio, that's Francis, when confronted with the reasonably argued contestation of the error, would understand, correct the heterodox points, and ask for forgiveness. Heterodox means heretical, basically, points that in there, contrary to the doctrine of the church. Obviously, he didn't do that. He completely ignored them, and a couple of them have already passed away. Okay, let's see what other. I actually got highlighted too much. Okay. He said he knew they should have known what they did. The people who elected Bergoglio as Francis I knew what they were doing. It was orchestrated. They needed somebody there who would finish the revolution for them. They say that John Paul II has been canonized and things like that. He is no more St. John Paul II than the man on the moon. It doesn't matter that the Pope went through the actions of doing it. They proclaimed him as saint, which he certainly is not, to canonize Vatican II. They had no interest in him in particular, or his actions, or his scandals, or anything like that. They were quick to canonize Vatican II, and that's what they did there. So they say in the room of tears, the room next to the Sistine Chapel, it's called the room of tears because when somebody's elected Pope, they go into the room of tears and they have to leave their previous life behind. No more will they have any private life really whatsoever. They weep for the past that they're leaving. They weep for the future, the great responsibility they have on their shoulders at the time. And the first thing, what did he do? Well, he says, well, Monsignor Guido Marini prepared the white rocchetta, which is like a surplice thing, the mozzetta that goes over it, and the beautiful stole you've seen popes up here on the balcony on when they're first elected. It was like the mozzetta is a shoulder cape. Well, the first thing he did was Bergoglio comes in and said, "Sono finite le carnevallate." The carnivals are over, meaning I'm not dressing like a clown. Now, Bergoglio scornfully refused the insignia that all the popes up until then had humbly accepted as the distinguishing garb of the Vicar of Christ. But those words contain truth, even if spoken involuntarily. On March 13th, 2013, the mask fell away from the conspirators, who were finally free of the inconvenient presence of Benedict XVI, and brazenly proud of having finally succeeded in promoting a cardinal who embodied their ideals, their way of revolutionizing the Church, of making doctrine malleable, morals adaptable, liturgy adulterable, and discipline disposable. And all this was considered by the protagonists of the conspiracy themselves, the logical consequence and obvious application of Vatican II, which according to them had been weakened by the critiques expressed by Benedict XVI. The greatest affront of that pontificate was the liberal permission of the celebration of the venerated Trinity liturgy, the legitimacy of which was finally recognized, disproving 50 years of its illegitimate ostracization. It is no accident that Bergoglio's supporters are the same people who saw the council as the first event of a new church, prior to which there was an old religion with an old liturgy. And I don't know your experiences, I can tell you mine, but going into seminary, first in modern seminary and getting out of there very quickly, but they spoke of, there was nothing before Vatican II. That was the old church. What they believed before Vatican II was the old religion. Never mind, that's what the church always believed and did for 2,000 years. Suddenly, everything had to start at Vatican II to be accepted, and that's what he's saying here. Okay, okay, he talks about, basically, what he says is that, without going too much into that, he says that at Vatican II, the revolutionaries started a parallel church which is not the Catholic Church. It is opposed to the Catholic Church. It is the opposite of the Vatican Church, and it is basically the product of Satan. It is the product of the enemies of the church, the Freemasons and like. That is what is out there passing as your average Catholic church these days. Saint this and Saint that down the street that do Mass in the vernacular in English and, all the other stuff they do. He is saying that they are a parallel church opposed to the Church of Christ, which was begun at Vatican II. And of course, most of us, that's what we've been saying for a long time. But here to have an archbishop of the church finally realizing that it is something of an epic event. Okay, what I want to just end up with is this last little bit here. So he knows the way Freemasons operate. Freemasons run Rome, by the way. They pretty much run the church at this point. I remember when I was living I used to have to I was one of the people crazy enough to drive in Rome. So I was like the driver for our order when somebody had to go to Rome. And one of my friends, he was a Count Neri Capone, had 2 palaces in downtown Florence, really cool guy to know. And he was traditional though. He goes, if you want to amuse yourself, when you go to Rome, because you have to go to these different offices, he goes, do this, and he showed me one of the secret Freemasonic handshakes, okay? And he says, do that when you go into these offices of Rome and see what happens. They all responded. Every single one of them gave me the secret handshake back. Every single time. Okay? And so it was absolutely amazing. So that's what's going on here. Anyway, he said, what will happen to Bergoglio, of course, he doesn't. He goes, to watch over the... Okay, the operation of intellectual honesty requires a great humility. That means to go back on Vatican II and realize it was a mistake, have another ecumenical council and reverse everything. First of all, in recognizing for decades we have been led into error by people who established an authority have not known how to watch over and guard the flock of Christ. Some for the sake of living quietly, some because of having too many commitments, some out of convenience, and finally some in bad faith or even malicious intent. These last ones who have betrayed the church must be identified, taken aside, invited to amend, and if they do not repent, they must be expelled from the sacred enclosure, meaning the church. This is how a true shepherd acts, who has the well-being of the sheep at heart, who gives his life for them. We have had and still have far too many mercenaries for whom the consent of the enemies of Christ is more important than fidelity to his spouse. So what he ends up by saying is something that they don't want to hear at all. He says, the Pope, you have to declare all this wrong, come back to the church. But he says if they don't, then and if Bergoglio does not follow the directions, he's under orders from the Freemasons, basically. He said if Bergoglio does not follow the directions he has received, ranks of theologians and clergy are ready to lament over the solitude of Pope Francis as a premise for his resignation. On the other hand, it would not be the first time that they use the Pope when he goes along with their plans and get rid of him or attack him as soon as he does not. In conclusion, last Sunday the Church celebrated the Most Holy Trinity, and in the breviary it offers us the recitation of the Athanasian Creed. Remember we talked about St. Athanasius, about the only bishop in the Church who was not a heretic at the time of the Arian heresy. Well, he wrote a creed. It's like the Apostles' Creed, it's like the Nicene Creed, but much fuller and much more to the point. Look up the Athanasian Creed if you get a chance. It's in my breviary because I say the traditional breviary. It's been outlawed in the modern church. You can no longer say this creed in the modern church. It's not in their books anymore. And the reason why, just look how it opens up. He goes, last Sunday the church celebrated the Most Holy Trinity. And in the breviary it offers us the recitation of the Athanasian Creed, now outlawed by the conciliar liturgy, Vatican II liturgy, and already reduced to only 2 occasions in the 1962, which, another day's work there. The first words of that now disappeared creed remain inscribed in letters of gold. Quicumque vult salvus esse, ante omnia opus estud teneat catholicam fidem, quam nisi quisque integram inviolatamque servaverit, absque dubio in aeternam perit. Whosoever wishes to be saved, this is essential for salvation, whosoever wishes to be saved, before all things, it is necessary that he hold the Catholic faith. For unless a person shall have kept this faith whole and inviolate, without doubt he shall eternally perish. Carlo Maria Vigano, Archbishop, titular archbishop of that place. So my dear faithful, look, he places obligations on us as well. There are different things you have to do. And one of them is you have to read many things. One is you have to read for spiritual reading. You have to read to know what the faith consists of. And you have to read to know what's going on in the church. You know, if you just go back to this parish that has a Spanish Mass or an English Mass, it's not the language of the Mass. That is a new rite that was written by 2 Freemasons and 6 Protestant ministers. That isn't this Mass in English. That isn't this Mass in Spanish. That was a Mass designed to take everything Catholic out of it and destroy the church. And look around you. What's left? You know, you've got Sister Daisy in spandex giving out communion and pirouetting in liturgical dance across the sanctuary while the priest sits there with a stupid look on his face and lets it all happen. That isn't Catholic, and that is not the Catholic Church. Please sit down, read this as part of realizing what's going on in the church and understand it comes from somebody who knows.